And welcome to today's webinar, Building Adaptation Skills in the Economic Sectors. This webinar is the fifth of 7 under the Building Adaptation Skills for a Changing Climate series, which is designed to share experiences on how to build climate change adaptation skills. My name is Marianne Wilson, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm a senior manager at Natural Resources Canada in the Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division. First, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently working from the traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe nations. And I also recognize that we're all working in a different place and therefore working in different Indigenous territories. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on this. The webinar today is made possible with funding support from Natural Resources Canada through Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Platform and the Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise Program, also known as BRACE. BRACE was a 5-year program, ended in March 22. It funded 20 projects across several themes to increase capacity of organizations, professionals, communities, and businesses to adapt to a changing climate. We will add a link to the BRACE webpage and the BRACE library in the chat, where you can find some more information on the projects and the results. This webinar series features work done under BRACE and other related initiatives. And the first 2 webinars focused on building capacity for engineers and planners, while the third one looked at upskilling the workforce through cross-sectoral training, guided by the competency frameworks and micro-credentials, and the fourth focused on water management. Today's webinar will focus on building capacity for various economic sectors throughout Canada. So a few technical details before we start. Claire Saunders from Climate Risk Institute is our technical support person for the webinar today, and she's available to run if you run into any audio or technical issues. Click on the chat box and find her name in the drop-down menu of participants and send her a direct message if you need assistance. So I'd also like to note that your microphones have been automatically muted to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. There's going to be a dedicated Q&A session at the end, but that doesn't mean you have to hold your questions until then. Please feel free to type your questions in during the presentations in the Q&A box. The chat box is also available if you'd like to submit any comments. Please note this webinar is being presented in English, but the questions can be asked in French. Notez que le webinaire est en anglais seulement, mais les questions peuvent être posées en français. We are recording the webinar today, and we will be sending out the link to everyone who has registered, along with a copy of the registration slides. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers at this time, Roger Rempel, Joshua Barrett, and Jennifer Graham. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Roger Rempel, who will speak about building climate adaptation capacity in Manitoba's northern business sector. Roger is the Climate Change Resilience Service Lead at Dillon Consulting. He's an environmental engineer and a certified infrastructure resilience professional with over 30 years experience in environmental assessment, climate change vulnerability assessment, industrial risk assessment, and federal provincial environmental assessment processes. Roger was the project manager for Dillon's role in the BRACE Manitoba Climate Resilience Training Project, which saw the development and delivery of course modules to increase climate change resilience for Manitoba's northern business sector. The floor is yours, Roger. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marianne, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. It's December already. It seems a little weird, but I want to talk to you today about the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training Project. And our focus is on building climate adaptation capacities for Manitoba's northern business sector. And the challenge that was in front of us was creating urgency and awareness about climate resilience under the conditions of COVID, wildfire, and drought. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to talk a bit about what MCRT was all about. Next slide again. This project, the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training Project, was part of the BRACE initiative, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change. MCRT was considered foundational for progress against 3 of Manitoba's adaptation pillars in its climate green plan. And that first adaptation pillar was simply building the knowledge and capacity to take action, and then mainstreaming climate adaptation planning into actual business decision-making processes. So making it part of the normal practice. And then thirdly, measuring results. And then most importantly in this third pillar is demonstrating the value of higher resiliency in Manitoba. And when we talk about climate resilience, just want to point out, we're talking about equipping businesses to successfully cope with climate-related shocks and stresses. And when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about the adjustments to those stresses and shocks to help them cope and be resilient. Next slide, please. So we had 2 key objectives in the MCRT project. Overall, was to engage and consult with 4 economic sectors in Manitoba. Dillon was just one of the sectors of the 4 that the BRACE project in Manitoba comprised. And overall, we were coordinated by partners. ICLEI was the overall sector coordinator. The Engineering Association in Manitoba was responsible for developing the capacity training and infrastructure design. The University of Winnipeg and the Prairie Climate Center was responsible for the resiliency planning, capacity building training for professional planning sector. And Dillon was responsible to address the climate training needs and the capacity building needs for the northern business sector. And last but not least, the Prairie Climate Center and Turtle Lodge were responsible for building capacity building training to service the Indigenous sector. And so we're developing all these capacity building trainings specifically responding to the needs that each sector has identified for us or indicated for us. Next slide, please. I want to take a moment just to consider the problem we were responding to. In Manitoba, there's a really strong and urgent need for new capacities in climate change resilience in Manitoba. And when we say new capacities, it's really foundational capacities. In particular, the climate risk hazard identification and assessment capacities, because in Manitoba, and this may not be unusual for other jurisdictions as well, but the prior messaging is focused almost exclusively about greenhouse gas reductions and management. And so our target stakeholders in the business sector, they face challenges in climate impact awareness and even knowing the extent of their climate risk exposure in their business. And so part of our mission was to draw out the information to help them understand where they could have climate risks lurking in their core operations, in their value chain, and in their broader networks for their business. Next slide, please. So we completed 2 primary tasks to define training needs for the business sector. We did this engagement with the Manitoba Northern business stakeholders to identify their training needs. And then to supplement that, we also looked at what was available in Canada and internationally as well to serve climate resilience, capacity building content. Is there anything tailored to Northern business? Is there anything tailored to business that might be relevant? And we found that there was large gaps in climate change capacity training that are specific for business applications, supply chain, staffing, that sort of thing. There's little to no climate change adaptation and resilience training materials that were specifically tailored to the Northern business context in Manitoba or Northern business in general. And so there's a pronounced gap that exists in training content that the stakeholders themselves said would support their business decision-making and risk planning, risk reduction planning measures. So they really needed a lot of capacity building in these key areas. That was their largest need. Next slide, please. Next, please. So before we developed our materials, our capacity building training, there are a couple of considerations you really need to figure out before you even start. The first one is, has the sector been approached before on climate resilience programs or any messaging or ad campaigns? For us in Manitoba, this program was really the first systematic organized climate resilience outreach targeted towards the Northern Manitoba business sector. You also have to look at the project context as well. And in Manitoba, climate change programming, as I mentioned before, was pretty much focused on GHG emissions and reduction planning. And that's specifically very true for the business sector. Almost all the messaging pertain to that. It's very important work, of course, but there's also the adaptation and the risk management side that we were trying to build the capacity in this project. Next slide, please. So for our own portion of the MCRT project, focusing on Northern business stakeholders, we built 6 courses developed in response to the identified needs. 5 of these training modules were specifically intended for business stakeholders, and 1 cross-sectional module was more foundational, intended to service and provide training for all the other sectors, the other 3 sectors under the Manitoba project. Our first course was climate change impacts for northern Manitoba businesses, and we looked at impacts, trying to talk about indirect and direct impacts related to winter roads, stranded heavy equipment, project materials, supply delays, healthcare, travel delays, tourism opportunities, and also impacts. So we brought all of these out and toured businesses through all the areas that climate change can kind of cause trouble for them in their operations and their assets and so on. Then we looked at climate change risk assessment and tried to build some core principle capacities for all the sectors in MCRT. We then took that core principles and applied that specifically to a business sector application. So climate change risk assessment for Manitoba northern businesses, where we worked stakeholders through working on a risk assessment applied to an actual hypothetical business scenario. And then business continuity planning and climate change. We developed a module for this because we found some really good natural alignment between business continuity and climate change assessment. So we tried to bring those 2 together and take advantage of the familiarity that some of our business stakeholders had on business continuity planning. Next, introduction to cost and benefits of climate change adaptation measures for northern business was important. One of the key messages we heard from our stakeholders is they want to know more about adaptations, the costs, the benefits, case studies. And then introduction to climate change funding programs. This was a module that we provided just to provide a bit of an introduction, a tour through the landscape of the various funding mechanisms that are available for resilience action from the federal and the provincial government. Next slide, please. Now, although our project finished in March of this year, the legacy training lives on, and thanks to Climate West, who's partnered with us, we have long-term hosting established for the full portfolio of MCRT climate resilience capacity building courses. So this is asynchronous, free, train at your own pace learning modules. They're all available at this address here on your screen. And this is sector-specific content. It represents a strong foundational library of free content that any business can jump on and take advantage of. No travel, just train at your desk. The concepts in this training are applicable to any business entity with operations in Manitoba, but it's also content that's relevant to regions outside of Manitoba. And in the screen captures you see on the right, you see examples of the kinds of materials that are waiting for you at the Climate West site. You'll see Northern Business. You can go into all the training there, Indigenous modules and planning modules, and then the infrastructure engineering ones as well. Next slide, please. I want to talk about a few best practices and lessons learned as we delivered this project. And the first one is to prepare to pivot against emerging challenges. We had an awful lot of these in the project. This project was an extremely challenging one from an engagement standpoint, an in-person engagement standpoint, and a virtual standpoint. We had wildfire and smoke, we had drought, we had extreme heat, and we had the pandemic on top of all of that. And when you add all that together, it meant cross-cutting impacts for our stakeholders. This was not the only disruption that these folks faced, and these impacts were really disruptive. This fire season we had last year was one of the most intense we've had in decades. We had over 4,000 Manitobans who were evacuated from 7 First Nation communities and 2 northern communities. 2 communities remained evacuated for a really prolonged period because the power lines that serviced them were destroyed from fire. And no certainty in business stakeholder schedules because of all this dynamic crises that they were responding to. So many were called away for urgent responses. You know, they'd RSVP that they'd attend an event, and then they were called away at the last minute. Next slide, please. And so we had to pivot again. And at the beginning of this project, it was understood that this project was conceived as an in-person delivery, in-person engagement, in-person working meetings. None of that was possible due to the COVID restrictions. We tried to do all this virtually. We found that due to the pressures that our business stakeholders faced, that we just weren't getting the attendance. We were getting good numbers of people saying they wanted to be there, but then on the day of the event, we found they couldn't attend. And So those virtual engagements were impractical. And so we spoke with the province and we came up with the agreement to go to a direct key person interview process. And Blake Russell of Infinite Consulting, our partner, did a great job of reaching out and meeting with these stakeholders individually and getting our engagement results through that means. Just to tell you elaborate on the impacts that we were facing here, like wildfire and smoke, that meant health impacts for residents, air traffic, surface traffic restrictions, evacuations. The drought, we had so many trails and backcountry restrictions in the areas. In the province, the fire potential was massive, and we had water scarcity to deal with as well. And then the heat and smoke together created a lot of health impacts, particularly for older residents in these communities who had breathing difficulties. So pivoting over and over again was a key part of this project. Next slide, please. And so lessons learned, this one's obvious to all of us. Like, it doesn't matter if you're dealing with a water conservation project, a drunk driving campaign, prior messaging is really important for the uptake in your program. And so under the best circumstances, we need to have prior messaging to the business sector. Particularly to sell the need for and the benefits of climate resilience. We tried to partner with the media to try and generate more interest, but local media had a very limited appetite for climate resilience coverage, particularly in a global pandemic environment. There was one article that they put in the business section in a local paper for the Indigenous portion of the MCRT project, but that was all that could be gained for coverage, and despite our best efforts. Next slide, please. Another lesson that we learned is that despite all the intentions that business stakeholders had, they were interested in our topics, our subject matter, the capacity they had, eagerness for, everything was trumped by business and commercial survival and viability during these very dynamic circumstances. Many of these communities, as I mentioned, were really heavily impacted, health and business, supply chain issues, and even staff. A lot of them couldn't get their staff into work because they had illness at home or they had issues getting to work. All of that played factors in our ability to get our stakeholders engaged in virtual means. Next slide, please. Another key lesson is that what kind of awareness and what kind of context exists to drive your stakeholders to take action in this area. And for us, that was a bit of a challenge because there's no regulatory or climate policy context that urges business to take action in climate resilience in Manitoba. And there's no real awareness of the impacts and liabilities, and all that matters. Business sector is not regulated by climate resilience. There are some sectors that do have an element of regulation in them to impose or encourage climate action. Professional engineering is one where you need to consider climate change in professional practice as part of your due diligence. And the Engineers Canada Engineering Scope of Code of Practice and the World Federation of Engineering Organizations also stipulate that climate change needs to be considered. And there's liability to you professionally if you're a designer of infrastructure and you did not consider climate change. So in some professions, we have that expectation. We don't have that for business yet. Although in the investment field, you're seeing a lot of advocacy for climate risk disclosure, and that will eventually trickle down to smaller businesses as well. Next slide, please. So we built training products to provide foundational guidance for the business sector. And we did that to respond to their identified key needs. And we responded to their need for guidance to assess and identify climate risk, guidance on the impacts management of climate impacts, guidance on cost benefit assessment and reporting for adaptations that are under consideration. And then we also advanced them in climate adaptation and risk reduction case studies. However, one area we couldn't deliver yet is there's a strong appetite for local Manitoba case studies, and we simply don't have a lot of those in Manitoba yet. That number will grow with time, and we'll be able to rectify that perhaps in a future BRACE phase. And speaking of future phases of BRACE, this one positioned Manitoba very well for development of future capacity building modules. Sector-specific training for additional Manitoba sectors could be considered in a new phase of BRACE, and expanding the existing training for current Manitoba sectors could also be considered. And so at the end of this project, we built a strong capacity building foundational training library. It's very highly suitable for future resilience training programs to build on. However, it doesn't completely fulfill all the resilience needs for the economic sectors. There still is more detail we can provide them, more depth in the training, and that's something for a future phase of BRACE. Next slide, please. And so just to leave you with a couple of thoughts, or when you're developing capacities in climate resilience, keep in mind that your approach to them in building this capacity program is probably the first opportunity that they get to build that foundational local capacity. So build that foundation with the business sector, keeping in mind that you need to sell the benefits of proactive response. You have to understand or make them understand the triggers that drive climate impact and where these impacts lurk, and the approaches to anticipate those impacts across the various levels of their business. And good business practice leads to climate resilience planning. And I mentioned business continuity planning before. This is a really strong pathway to climate resilience planning because people who are already engaged in this have that muscle to assess risk, and they'll naturally gravitate to climate risk if given the opportunity to do so. Next slide. So embrace those instances where your training is eye-opening, because that will, you can leverage that new awareness to inspire action, either with a company getting going on this or with a champion in that company who sees the consequences, the potential consequences of climate change and want to act. So build that content upon foundational approaches and place an emphasis on accessible, clear formats for a range of technical audiences. Thanks very much. Hope I didn't go too much over time.
Thank you, Roger. Excellent presentation. Covered a lot of information there. I'm just checking for any clarifying questions, because we'll have some Q&A discussion at the end. So seeing none, I am going to introduce our next speaker. It's Josh Barrett. He's a manager of planning and accountability for the Climate Change Branch, Department of Environment and Climate Change, Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. In this role, he leads collaborative initiatives to support other departments and the delivery of public policy commitments on climate change and energy efficiency. He's worked on raising public awareness and engaging the academic community, professional associations, municipalities, and other organizations as it pertains to climate change adaptation. Josh will be speaking to us today about the work in Newfoundland with several economic sectors, and as well as the lessons learned in their work. Thank you. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you for that introduction, Marianne, and thank you all today for coming, as well as my other panelists. As part of this, it's great that we have this collective community that we can learn, whether it's key economic sectors or other capacity building exercises. So today I wanted to discuss some of the work that we have pursued here in Newfoundland and Labrador on building capacity, adaptation capacity in key economic sectors, some of the work that we've done, some of the tools that we were developing, some of the lessons learned for the future. So just moving on, I can discuss a bit about what we did with thanks to the BRACE program and Natural Resources Canada for making this possible. And so building adaptation capacity in key economic sectors, we called it BACCUS for short. We focused on 5 key sectors: agriculture, fisheries, forestry, mining, and tourism. And we worked with the industry associations with all of these respective sectors. We also had support from EcoNex, which is a provincial environmental industry association here, and they had excellent networking opportunities and training and helped facilitate a lot of dialogue over the course of this project, which was very helpful. And so using the 1.6 million we received from funding, we were able to look at the risks and impacts and vulnerabilities of climate change adaptation, or climate change rather, in these sectors, but also opportunities for these sectors. And I'll chat a bit more about the opportunities throughout the presentation. And this work really paired well with our risk assessment work. We use the BRACE program to help augment capacity in these industry associations and their connections with key members and trying to get some of that bottom up membership driven ideas, whereas through our risk assessment, we were able to hire a consultant to do more of a technical academic piece of work here. And so that worked out really well and helped frame some future actions and priorities. Just going on to our key partners here, as I noted, we work with a number of key organizations. These are the sector organizations that we partnered with, and wanted to thank them for all of their work throughout the project. So really the project objectives moving on, as we had 3 pillars, and that was to help raise awareness and education, really looking at disseminating information, building capacity, building new knowledge, identifying risks with respect to climate change, identifying opportunities with respect to climate change. Maybe there's different crops, maybe there's longer growing seasons, maybe there's different products that can be developed, different training opportunities as a result of climate change. But at the end of the day, you can have awareness, you can identify all of these risks and opportunities, but we felt it was important to really mobilize our partners to address these risks, seize these opportunities, and developed resources and training that they would have the ability and the capacity to really address the climate change needs relevant for their sectors. And understandably so, a lot of different sectors had varying levels of understanding and existing work with respect to climate change. Our province has a big focus and emphasis on fisheries related research, and as it were working with the fisheries organizations, they had a great deal of existing capacity with respect to climate change and understanding, whereas working with the agriculture, certainly the forestry and the tourism sectors, they really started from the ground when it came to climate change, certainly from an adaptation perspective. And so going into this project, we knew and embraced that there would be certain organizations ready and willing to immediately develop new products and training opportunities for their members, and some really need to focus on the education and awareness, and some encapsulated all 3 of those over the course of the project. A lot of important partners that I wanted to give mention to. We used the industry associations and trade unions through that to connect with the private sector. That was a very organized approach for us, which helped enable our work a bit easier, as they have existing relationships with their memberships, as opposed to us trying to work with on our own with certain sectors. That rapport and collegiality that those industry associations had with sectors was very useful for this project. And certainly our federal and provincial government department partners and academic institutions were very much beneficial throughout this whole exercise. And so just on the next slide, certainly a lot of great and interesting work as an outcome of this project. And I don't have time to speak about all of these wonderful outcomes here today. I will just be honing in on the tourism sector, but I did want to give some Coles notes on all 5 of the projects that we did. And so forestry and agriculture, this was really a lot of the foundational work to address climate change. Both sectors in our province certainly well aware of the track record, perhaps, that they have as a GHG emitter, but with respect to adaptation capacity, we were able to build a lot of awareness and identify some risks and opportunities with respect to climate change. That was very important, and build a lot of knowledge and understanding among industry operators. So we were quite happy with that. With the fisheries sector, they had a more enable understanding and capacity to really work on moving and mobilizing some of this climate data into more targeted efforts. And so invasive species, as many of us working in the field are aware, is a huge piece with respect to fisheries. And so looking at green crab and the impact of green crab, and they were working with fish harvesters and Department of or Fisheries and Ocean Canada rather to enable that work. The mining sector was a very interesting project insofar that it had a number of delays off the hop because of COVID-19, and I'll mention that with the tourism sector as well. But eventually we were able, and the sector, our partner, the industry association, was able to work with companies to initially, certainly with a consultant development audit tool for operators to identify climate change risks, and then get these one-on-one report cards for operators about some of the risks and opportunities with climate change. And so we were able to get these individual case study reports, as well as aggregating that data on some of the risks and opportunities with climate change from an adaptation perspective as well. Certainly the mining industry is a very carbon intensive industry, although in recent time we know there are opportunities for that to be used for cleaner energy. But from an adaptation perspective, that was an interesting exercise that we were happy to be a part of. And with the tourism products that we established through this program, and I'll be speaking more to that for the remainder of my few moments here, the industry originally wanted to do, given that this was the baseline work, they wanted to really raise the awareness of climate change to their members. They had some very key members, particularly in what I'll call marine-based experiences. If you're doing boat tours or whatever, they are more in tune with the changes of climate with respect to the fish and whatnot. But there are other members that weren't so knowledgeable about those types of things. And so the initial plan was to do an industry awareness exercise. The ability to engage operators was impacted through COVID-19, and that plan was redirected into doing more of a research exercise on various risks with respect to climate change, as well as opportunities for specific tourism sectors. So we just move on to the next slide. I can speak about that a bit more. The tourism sector, what the money we initially had allocated for the engagement exercise was reallocated towards identifying and getting further knowledge about risks with respect to some key tourism subsectors in our province. These are marine-based sectors, such as boat tours, such as activities, ocean-based activities, outfitting, such as hunting, and then winter tourism sectors, such as skiing and those types of outdoor activities. Some key risks, certainly, we see with boat tours, with coastal infrastructure, ocean species. We see that cross-cutting with the fishery sector. With outfitting, we see a very much unreliable hunting window, and we see different migratory patterns for the species, of course, which impact the activities, cultural activities of residents, as well as indigenous populations, as well as the impact pests have on those animals. And then certainly with winter, there is certainly less snow on the ground, shorter stays, unreliable and inconsistent ice conditions as well, with periods of increased warming, periods of increased cooling is much more unreliable and unpredictable. And so identifying all of these risks, they were actually able to work with the consultant CBCO to develop a risk assessment tool for tourism operators. And part of this work was an actual a checklist, a matrix in which, as an operator, you could take from it and look at your operations and determine what some of your key critical infrastructure is, what are some of the key products that you deliver, what are some of the temperature projections, all these things, and determine what level of risk that you have for your operation. And certainly the industry association felt, which I certainly agree with, is that well, okay, as an operator, you understand the level of risk in which you have for climate change, but what does this really cost? What is the bottom line for this? And from that, they developed a cost benefit analysis. They used some case studies to determine what some of the costs would be to mitigate or not mitigate some of these climate change projected impacts and some of these projected risks. And so we felt that this paired this tool to identify these risks and also show operators, hey, you can determine what your risks. By the way, climate change is going to cost X amount of dollars for your sector. So it would be really useful for you to understand what these impacts are from a bottom line perspective and be able to mitigate those challenges. And something really cool that we're polishing off right now is some regional snow projections. This is a very, very new piece of work that the consultant did that we feel will be very versatile for a number of sectors, and they're just polishing that off now before we are in a position to disseminate that. It's not overly granular. There might be 4 regions in terms of snow projections, so more regional as opposed to local projections, but certainly very useful mid-century projections. And then at the end of the day, and I recognize I'm starting to run short on time, but we were able to train the industry associations that they can actually work with those operators and those proponents on the ground to use these risk assessment tools and partner with these operators to be able to actually equip them with what they need to. So quickly, the final slide I'll really chat about is just some of the takeaways. Certainly, we've all lived through the impacts of COVID-19 and what we need to do and how we need to be versatile to deal with those changes. And working with the private sector, as our earlier panelists mentioned, is certainly a priority, but we need to note and reframe some of the conversation that this is an opportunity for you folks to build on some of the existing work and save your bottom line at the end of the day. And we have had a fortunate ability to build some really great information and tools, and through this project we were able to build and work with capacity that is very much lacking in a lot of these sectors. And while our office might have available data and information that people can gather and use, industries and organizations really need that capacity in order to do that. And so certainly looking forward to following up on some of this work moving forward. I have a few next steps and priorities that we would be considering moving forward in the future, but I'll certainly park that there. But the next slide is just where you can find a bit more information about some of our work. The resources I mentioned on the tourism sector will be online in a matter of days. And again, just want to thank Natural Resources Canada and the BRACE program in particular for enabling us to build that capacity in these sectors in Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks.
Thank you for that presentation, Josh. Again, a lot of effort and a lot of progress and overcoming a lot of challenges along the way. So certainly great to hear about your work. And we do have a couple of questions, but I think just to manage the presentations, then we'll save those, Josh, for you for the Q&A. So next we'll introduce Jennifer. I want to remind people, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. And those that we don't get to, we'll have a written reply afterwards, separately by email. So Jennifer Graham has been part of the Nova Scotia Environment and Climate Change Adaptation team since 2014. In her role as manager of the Climate Adaptation Leadership Program, she supports government and sectoral teams in identifying key climate risks and priorities for their sectors and developing adaptation strategies to help position them for strategic action in a changing climate. So Jennifer, on that note, I will pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It's really nice to be here speaking about the work we did in Nova Scotia, which of course is the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I want to talk today about a sectoral approach we took to building adaptive capacity in 3 agricultural commodities in Nova Scotia. Next slide. So I think the problem is probably fairly clear to most of us when we're speaking about the agricultural sector. Of course, we mean farmers and farm families and the economic and social benefits they derive from agriculture. But agriculture has many other social and economic benefits to the province and nationally. Farmers and the agricultural sector in general is already facing impacts of climate change, especially from extreme weather and increased uncertainty. And though we tend to speak of agricultural sector as a whole, in reality, each of these agricultural commodities or agricultural sectors is quite distinct. So we do need customized strategies that are appropriate for their unique context in order to support adaptation to climate change. So the work that we did as part of the BRACE program focused on 3 sectors in particular: Christmas tree, cattle and sheep, and horticulture. I'm going to talk about them as a whole, despite what I just said about the importance of specific strategies, but I'll draw on some examples for unique to each. So next slide. So the program that the Climate Change Division at Environment and Climate Change in Nova Scotia did was called the Climate Adaptation Leadership Program. And this is the program that we developed and coordinated and implemented in a number of different government departments and economic sectors with NRCan support through BRACE. A couple of things I wanted to highlight that were unique to the agricultural sector. One is that we had a request for proposal process. So we used communication channels within the agricultural sector and asked commodity groups if they wanted to work with us to develop an adaptation strategy. The 3 that we worked with were 3 that applied. And we explained what we would bring to the table in terms of coordinated, dedicated support and some resources. But we asked them to not only contribute association time, but also to help us secure some producers, so some on-farm people, and work with us to get other people from their distinct value chains to join with us. So we guided these 3 sector teams for Christmas trees, horticulture, and cattle and sheep through what's a fairly standard adaptation process. Step 1, we spent some time helping define the problem with them, collect information, and come to a common understanding of the top climate risk and priorities for those sectors. Step 2, we use that with them to develop adaptation strategies. And as the work continues, this is what we completed in this phase of the work, we'll go on to implementation, monitoring, and adjusting. Next slide, please. Key partners in this, of course, were the producer associations for each of the scans: horticulture, cattle and sheep, and Christmas tree and greenery, as well as colleagues at Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture. We worked closely with the Federation of Agriculture, as well as Perennia. So Perennia is an arm's length crown corporation for-profit crown corporation that supports marketing and innovation in the agricultural sector in Nova Scotia. A lot of academic institutions also contributed time, both to these, what we call the scan teams, so the teams of people that went through the process with us, but also each sector had a governance team that had higher level folks that guided the process and provided some oversight. So with that initial NRCan contribution, we were able to leverage a lot of provincial dollars, but a lot of in-kind time from across value chains. The outcomes that we were after with our climate adaptation leadership program, but for the sectors in particular, were really around increased capacity. We wanted sectors to be aware of the unique climate risk now and into the future for their sector, but also any opportunities that might emerge. we wanted them to develop strategy documents that would help position them to act quickly on opportunities and risks. We wanted the sectors to come out of this with the partnerships and relationships and increased capacity to be able to implement, to sustain this work, keep it going over the long term. We had our partnership, our brace agreement in place, obviously, for 3 years. The work with the agricultural sector took place over 12 to 14 months. So we did those 3 scans over that time period. We produced unique data analysis reports for each of these 3 sectors, strategies that offer the outcomes that the sectors are after, as well as some priority short-term outcomes and actions. And then we have a number of tools that we developed over the course of this work. And I'm going to talk about 3 of them in the next few minutes. So next slide. So one of the tools we relied on were systems maps. This is an example, and it's an example from the cattle and sheep industry. And we wanted to take a whole value chain, or sometimes called commodity chain approach to adaptation. So we worked with this scan team, so with this team of people from throughout that value chain, to identify what were some of the key things and processes that mattered to cattle and sheep. We worked with them to define the outcomes of the sector, something like healthy animals, healthy environment, happy consumers, security. And so in order to achieve those outcomes, what are the things and processes that matter? And you can see this value chain is broken down into inputs, some of which are things like soil and water and communications and skills, processing, and the consumer end, consumer demand and marketing. And so we worked to try to figure out where along the value chain, what were some of the kind of risk and opportunities. And one of the key things about this system map was it was developed with stakeholders based on their own experience and knowledge. The next slide. So one of the things we did with those sector system maps is we produced sector-specific climate change surveys. So these surveys were tools for engagement with industry, because it was a way of letting people know what was going on, and also to get information from them about some of the top things and processes that were important to their sectors that were most at risk of climate change. So the survey was distributed and heavily promoted by the industry associations and the governance team. And the data analysis we did with that was in workshop format. It was collaborative with industry, and we used a lot of online analysis tools. Some really key considerations for this was that our survey team needed to feel that this tool represented what they saw as important and the climate risk they saw, so they would feel comfortable championing that. And also that the people who received it needed to recognize themselves in it in order to devote the time to this survey. We also asked about experiences of change in the industry. So we asked about climate risk, but one of our hypotheses is that past experiences navigating change, of which the agricultural sector has a lot, is a good predictor of ability to manage future change. So we wanted to ask a bit about past experiences of change. So last tool I wanted to talk about, next slide, were engaging workshops. So we did all of this through a series of workshops. We had to pivot, as other presenters mentioned, to go all online, which was not a huge hit with the agricultural sector. So we tried to design these workshops to get people talking to each other, to talk to people in other parts of the value chain that they might normally talk with. We really developed strong facilitation guides that really with clear outcomes and clear activities. And we use those workshops to check in and check out and get feedback from partners on how this process was going for them so that we could adapt it. And key consideration is we felt that having these structured, consistent, well-organized workshops got things done smoothly, but also built people's trust in the process and that we valued and respected their time. So next slide. So some of the lessons learned. We found that having a clear structured process that we could tell partners, we are going to work with you in this way, we're going through these steps, we're doing this number of workshops, here's what's expected of you, was really important for building trust and confidence. we did learn to trust some of the process and the thought we put behind it. There was definitely some pushback about some aspects of the work, particularly surveys, which associations thought, often rightly, it will be hard to get our members to do this. They're really busy folks, and this is long and maybe a little too abstract. So, but at the end, some of the things that people pushed back on, especially the surveys, got really positive response. We were really glad we did it. We learned a lot. We wish we'd done more. We wish we'd understood the value of this. So there was for us some key lessons around coming up with a process and being consistent and following it and sticking to your pathway. And what's going to sound like a contradiction, but really I think is the flip side of the same idea, also being really feedback responsive. We worked with producers through busy, stressful times, including COVID and a lot of extreme weather emergencies. We had a lot of dialogue both with our partners at the Department of Agriculture, but also with sector leads about what would make this work better. We stopped our process for 5 or 6 months with the Christmas Tree Association to accommodate for the busy time. We modified the in workshop data analysis we did with horticulture sector based on feedback. So while we stuck to our process, we heard and collected feedback and acted on it. And the last lesson, I think for us, was around the value of coordinated collective action. We deliberately took an all of value chain approach. And while many of the actions around adaptation and the strategy focus on things that can be done at the producer level to make their own individual operations more adaptive to climate change, we recognize that for this agricultural sectors to thrive, we're all in this, we all have a part to play. There's also actions related to more adaptive government programs, both to transfer knowledge, but also to help producers respond to untimely emergencies. There's also short-term actions and outcomes related to consumer awareness and consumer changes in behavior and belief, so that consumers as a whole and marketing as a whole can better support agriculture as it transitions. So the starting with a value chain and coming up with actions that applied to many different parts of the sector, I think showed not only ourselves, but also those we worked with that long-term adaptation is really a collective process. So last slide, or almost last slide, I guess, is the next steps. We see our role as a climate change group of having ongoing partnerships for implementation of the strategies that have been endorsed by the governance groups, as well as many of the associations. But we've been playing the coordinating role with coordinators that were in our own shop. And we want, in the next phase, we see that shifting to being hosted by these partner associations. So more on the ground and more better able to meet needs, but also more trusted, because there's only a certain amount of trust that as a provincial government agency we can legitimately maintain with producer associations. And we'd like to help these sectors move forward on their priority actions by helping them leverage resources and support and build the capacity needed for the priority actions. The same theme as were mentioned by Roger and Josh were held true for us as well. There was a real need for capacity on all aspects of adaptation. We also had some learning curriculums and modules that were part of our process, which I didn't talk too much about, but we see that ongoing support for ongoing capacity as part of our role. And finding ways to expand this work or a variation of it to other economic sectors in the agricultural field, because we only touched on 3 of what is, we know, a very wide and diverse pool. So the last slide is a thank you, specifically to Natural Resources Canada for this BRACE program, which really allowed us to do much of this work, but also leverage amazing partnerships. We received cash and huge amounts of in-kind contribution from provincial government partners, especially in this case to Department of Agriculture, and sector partners put in a lot of time participating in these SCAN teams, governing, giving their credibility and voice to the work. And we suspect that they'll be carrying the brunt of the implementation. So thank you to all of those partners. And that's what I got.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and great presentations all. So we have approximately 5 minutes here for a few questions, and looking forward to having a little bit of discussion here. So again, if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to put those in the Q&A and the chat, and we won't be able to get to them all, but we will endeavor to send an email reply following the session. So the one question I have here is for Roger, and it says, why did you consider prior climate resilience messaging important in your approach to the business sector stakeholders?
Yeah, that sets us up for the entire approach for how we build that capacity with those stakeholders. And we found that in other jurisdictions, we did encounter business that had some beginning capacity. They've rolled up their sleeves and begun working on adaptation. We found that less to be the case, especially with smaller and medium enterprise in Manitoba. Larger corporations, of course, global corporations are well active in resilience and adaptation planning and risk reduction. So it was important for us to understand that the capacity really had to start from a very basic level, and that's the approach we took to build. And it was important to just confirm that right from the start.
Thanks, Roger. The next question that I have is for all the presenters, actually. And I heard a lot of talk about the systems and value chains and the fact that you needed to look at these sectors more broadly. But based on your learning and working, and perhaps pick a sector because we don't have that much time. But I want to take a minute each and ask you a little bit about what if you had another sector in another region that was trying to do the work that you do, what would be your key takeaway message for them? Maybe we'll start with Josh.
Yeah, it's a good question. And what I would say is that I think this came out really in Jen's presentation really well, is that it's important to have positive relationships and trust with these industries and organizations in order to actually build effective capacity. And once you have that relationship, which was tested for all of us during COVID, and you're comfortable and you have that level of trust to disseminate some of the knowledge that we have, I think that would be really useful. We're going through a similar exercise now with our health sector and trying to look at some climate change priorities there. So certainly enabled to take some lessons learned from this project and apply it there.
Thanks, Josh. Jen, maybe I'll ask you to draw on, I'm sure you'll concur with Josh, but perhaps you want to pull out another area that you would suggest.
Well, it's definitely building on Josh, which I think is maybe co-designing the process with partners. We had a good process, the elements of it are solid, but there were many aspects of it that would have been better suited for these particular groups. This is not a group that likes any touchy-feely stuff, we know, we learned. So we had to adapt on the fly to the culture of the groups we were working with. So I think earlier co-design would be my recommendation.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen. Great insight. Roger?
Yeah, for us in any approach, we would just confirm what we think the stakeholders really need and respond directly to that. And especially give them stuff that's got value to them. Like for us, for our stakeholders, identifying and making explicit the indirect and direct impacts of climate change and mapping out where climate change can kind of bite them in places that they don't expect. That was something that was really important for our stakeholders. They saw value in that. It was something they could take back to their shop and actually start talking about. And that got the whole process going and the interest in capacity building and resilience. So it's really important to drive home why this matters and explain how that translates to their operations.
Okay, great takeaways, folks. We're at 1:59, so I'd like to just acknowledge there were a couple of questions related to youth and the need to whether there were activities focused on that. And I just wanted to mention there is a webinar, and next one in our series is on December 7th, and it's around building adaptation capacity for young professionals. And there was also a note about, the need to focus on youth and their well-being in a difficult time we're dealing with here in adapting our societies. So certainly I would encourage that question we can build on that in the next session. So here are a few references for you in the last slides. These slides will be sent out along with the recording after. There's a link to an evaluation in your chat. Please, we would welcome any feedback and suggestions and comments that will help us for future. And finally, then, I just want to let you know that we're very appreciative of our presenters and their time and sharing their knowledge and expertise and experiences. Again, thank you very much to all of you. And thank you to all of you for joining us on our webinar today. And we'll look forward to sending you additional replies to the points that we weren't able to get to. And we'll let you get on with your day. And thank you all, and have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone.